We're here today and this week to talk about partnerships, to talk about internationalization, how we collaborate, all of us, in fora like these and why this is important. Now, it is couched as a COVID story, but COVID is just the conduit. This is not really a COVID story. The importance of this goes far beyond and well beyond COVID, and it must last. It must last. It is absolutely critical that it lasts. So I'm going to tell you a short story about COVID in my country. I'm going to tell you some of the lessons that we learned, hard lessons. And I'm putting learned in inverted commas because I'm hoping that we learned. And then I'm going to tell you why you are very important and why this kind of thing is very important and must continue. And I'll try to wind all of that up before I get hooked off the stage. So we'll see how that goes. Now, if this entire building were the world, my country would be as big as a fingernail. And that is no exaggeration. We are really small. I just came from Malawi yesterday, and one of the ministers asked me, what is your population in Trinidad and Tobago? And I said, 1.4 million. And he said, are you a country or a village? And I said, we are a country, and very proud about it. But I get the point. We are really small. At the end, and I put end in context because it has not ended. Because COVID hasn't really ended, it's still there with us. But at the end of the struggle, where we were fighting to contain COVID, out of 1.4 million people, we suffered something like 4,300 deaths. Now, I say that with an asterisk because I know that many countries have very large numbers that would make that number seem tremendously insignificant. But what you must understand is that when you have 1.4 million people, which is a drop, not even a drop in the global barrel, and you lose 4,300 people to COVID, it means that every single person either knows somebody, knows of somebody, or has lost somebody to COVID. So the numbers might be small in a general sense, but in a contextual sense, for us, they were very traumatic. It still remains very traumatic. I lost my favorite uncle to COVID. So this for me is a very personal and personalized thing. When we became aware that there was something in the ether called COVID, because we had that normal response. We are in the Western Hemisphere, two very small islands. These things always seem to happen out there in what we call the big world. There is always some disease that we are panicking about, and then it just goes away. I'm sure you all remember SARS. There was a panic. You had bird flu, there was a panic. You had swine flu, and there was a panic. So we heard of this thing called COVID, and we were like, yeah, there'll be a big fuss. And then in a week or two, it will be gone, and then there'll be something new. And then it was not gone. And then it went from a curiosity to a worry, to a crisis, to an epidemic, and to a pandemic. And there's a wide range of ways in which governments and countries all over the world tried to deal with COVID. There were those who were laissez-faire. There were those who were pragmatic in their approach. They adjusted as the circumstances adjusted. My country took a very specific route. We tried our very best to manage the disease. Because the greatest fear we had was that, given our small size and small numbers, that our public healthcare system could very quickly be overwhelmed. And then we would go from a crisis to a calamity. That was our fear. So very early, long before the first case of COVID hit Trinidad, we had closed the borders. Only nationals, returning nationals were allowed to come, and we kicked in a whole suite of protocols. This is before the first case hit our country. We were already in lockdown in terms of the borders, By the time the first cases started to appear, we went into lockdown throughout the country. The attempt was to preserve as many lives as we could. But everything has costs, economic and otherwise. So at that time, I was in a very peculiar position. I was a member of parliament, and because our country is so small, when you are a member of parliament in my country, you directly interact with your voters, which could be very pleasant or very unpleasant, depending on the circumstance, or a mixture of both in the very same day. People were at home in their houses. People lost their income. The state intervened to find welfare mechanisms to deal with it. But as a member of parliament, you were often the person on the front line. I delivered vegetables to citizens. I delivered food. I delivered checks, because you are the person that people look to for leadership in a time of crisis. And if you take this thing seriously, and I took it seriously, you had to be there serving your constituents. I was also a member of parliament, so I was a member of the lawmaking body that was making policy to try to guide this process. And then I was one of 2 ministers of education, so I was dealing with the direct impact of COVID on the education system. It was just fortunate that by accident, not necessarily design, because nobody could predict that COVID would come and what it would mean. I was creating a whole suite of platforms and software to sort of take our education system into a different biosphere, to use a bad term. And it was fortunate that at the time COVID hit, education was the one sector that could adjust very quickly. This was not because of my brilliance or genius, it was purely by luck and chance, but it worked, so that the system never shut down. Education switched from face-to-face to online. It kept going. But everything else literally ground to a halt. And this is not a story that is alien to anybody here. We know the kinds of human hardships that engendered. And in fact, this story has not been told in entirety. There is a lot more that we need to discuss and to digest and to dissect here, because we haven't even understood the mental health impact of COVID. It will take us some time to get to the point where we fully understand this kaleidoscope. Even though we managed, quote unquote, successfully to contain COVID so that we only had 4,300 deaths, even though we managed the economic fallout, even though we managed the question of food security, our citizenry, even in the context of trying to make the best of the circumstances, and according to the WHO, we were amongst the best in terms of managing this disease. There was a lot of pain. There was a lot of suffering. There was a lot of hardship. And it didn't matter how effective you were, how well planned you were, how many systems you implemented. That was just the reality. It was hard. And it went on for 2 years, and it was hard. And we haven't fully discussed yet how hard it was and how impactful it was. And then I am standing here today, and we are talking about post-COVID, but there's no post-COVID. COVID is still here. But in the midst of this ordeal, we've learned a lot of lessons, or there's a verb I really hate to use called hope. I hope we've learned a lot of lessons, because we should have. We should understand now as a species that this nonsensical view we have, that we've tamed this planet and we own and control it, it's an illusion. The world is still a very dangerous biological landscape. We don't know what the next COVID-type disease will be. Right now, one of my staff is ailing from COVID. Another one had swine flu. In the West, we're dealing with some nonsense called monkeypox. The world is a dangerous biological landscape. We have not tamed it. That's human hubris at its most unfortunate. There are other lessons that should concern everybody here, particularly in institutions like this one. In the midst of the greatest information age in the human species, we had people losing their lives because of misinformation. That is a tragedy of tremendous proportions. And it's one that hit home particularly for me in my heart. Because when I started this talk, I talked about my uncle who died from COVID. He should be alive. He was one of those vaccine deniers, which was something I didn't expect to find in my family. And he lost his life because he refused to take the vaccine. That is a pain built upon a pain that I am still grappling with. That should happen, well, not to me, but to me and my family. How is it in the greatest information age the world has ever seen, misinformation seems so very powerful? That's something we collectively need to plan for and start doing something about. We cannot depend on the ether clearing itself. We must take over that narrative and build narratives that promote learning and information. There are other poignant lessons. I was very, very pleased that the Dean talked about the politics that emerged during COVID, that times of crises lend themselves far too well to extreme politics. And if there are any persons in this room, and I'm sure there are all of you, who are lovers of this imperfect, fragile, but tremendously important thing called democracy, then COVID was an eye-opening experience for all of us. And that has not ended. Vigilance is required from all of us and all like us. We should learn that we should be more humble. There were those of us who were big and powerful and rich who felt that they could stand alone and fight. And then a million deaths later, they understood that this was not a fight that anybody could wage on their own, that all of us had to work together. And this is where we come full circle. The only reason we've kept COVID at bay is because of partnership, is because of collaboration, is because of people from different realms and different spheres working together. It's because of institutions like KZN and others in South Africa, beyond into Africa, other African countries, into other continents. It's because governments put aside the intricacies of nonsensical petty politics and focused on tackling a major issue. It's because international agencies got on board. It's because the private sector understood that there was a responsibility here. Bereft of any of those parties, understanding that this was an existential crisis that required all hands on deck, bereft of any of that, we would still be in lockdown. I would not be standing here. We would not be having this conference. None of this would be happening. And a disease that we could have stopped by washing our hands would still be killing millions of us. We haven't stopped it. We haven't defeated it. We haven't tamed it. We've sort of corralled it. And it was only possible because all of us understood that we had to. And this is not the first time. If you do your research, there was once something called smallpox that was a death sentence on this planet that only now exists in labs controlled by crazy people. And it's only sequestered there because of that kind of international collaboration, that international partnership. So this is very important. And I'll come full circle again. It is not solely important because of COVID. When the historians write, they always write late, but eventually they'll write. They will say something banal. COVID was a watershed event in the history of the world. It might well turn out to be. But COVID is not the defining crisis of our times. It is the defining crisis of the last 2 years. The defining crisis of our times is climate change. So we've gotten together to fight this disease, and we think that we've conquered the world, but there is a greater crisis right in front of us. And take it from somebody who lives in a landscape that every year faces the specter of obliteration. And that is not exaggeration. That is not grandiosity. I am from the Caribbean. My country has the great good fortune of being located to the bottom of the region. So we are outside that dangerous zone called the hurricane zone. And if you don't know what a hurricane is, there is something, it's called a typhoon in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It's a big storm that builds over water. Every year, between the months of June and November, almost every Caribbean society besides Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados lives in mortal fear of obliteration. Hurricanes come in classes. And it used to be categories, they're classified in categories. It used to be the typical hurricane was a category 1, where you could go outside and say, hey, there's a storm. A category 2, where I had a friend who would actually go filming, he's an idiot, in the midst of a hurricane. Or a category 3, which would be dangerous, but if you're inside, you're basically safe. Category 4 storms will knock down buildings, will uproot trees, will send cars flying, but they were rare. Category 5 storms were generational. You'd have one every 10, 15, 20 years. It is now the case that because the planet is observably and measurably warming, and these storms draw their power from warm water. Because the Atlantic Ocean is warming, the typical hurricane that hits the Caribbean is now a category 4 and a category 5. We used to have a category 5 storm every 10 or 15 years. Now we have 2 or 3 every year. And if you have the great misfortune to just be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and this storm makes landfall, obliteration is not an exception. And if you think that I'm exaggerating, look up Dominica. Look up hurricane hitting Haiti. It was once the case that America didn't have to fear hurricanes. Look up what recently happened in Florida. Look it up yourself. And as the planet gets warmer and the climate changes, who is to say that there isn't going to be something called a category 6 hurricane that will obliterate civilizations? This is the fear that we live with every single year in the Caribbean. After Dominica was destroyed, we had to evacuate citizens to all over the Caribbean, even as far south as Trinidad, which is maybe more than 1,000 miles away. It was that devastating. And this is not our only problem. We have rising poverty. We have rising income inequality. We have countries that will suffer from a lack of water. We have countries that will not be able to feed themselves. And these things will cause conflict and chaos. So let me give you a scenario. And I've been talking, I don't want to go over my time because I really don't want that hook to pull me. It'll be a bit too funny. Let me give you a scenario where we go back into our silos. The businesses go back to just making $1. The governments go back to squabbling. The academics go back to their ivory tower, and we forget the template that helped us to cope with COVID. What happens? What happens is chaos. And there are some businesses that are so cynical that they believe that chaos is profitable. Chaos profits nobody in the long run. There are problems to be solved on this planet that cannot be solved by anyone by themselves. No nation, no institution, no university, no matter how brilliant, no one. We must collaborate. There must be no hard reset. The problems are too large. They are too immediate. They're not abstract. They're not out there. They're in front of us. There are some of us who live it every year, as I've just outlined to you. No, I'm not worried about the institutions of higher learning, because by their very nature, as the professor stated, you are international in the way you recruit your students, in the way you educate, in the way you hire. Your very ethos, your very DNA is internationalist. I'm worried about the others. So I hope that this kind of thing resonates with them. I hope we understand the template. I hope we don't change something that worked. Despite all the nonsense talk, it is a modern, quote-unquote, miracle that we could produce a vaccine for COVID in just a matter of months. Because of all the nonsense talk that surrounds it, we lose sight of the fact. We lose sight of the brilliance that was involved in this fight against COVID. The misinformation has obscured the absolute brilliance that was involved in it. We cannot lose that brilliance. We cannot go back to where we are. So I haven't really come here to lecture you. I've come here to share some ideas. I've come here to cajole, to encourage, to celebrate you. Because without you, the road into the future is going to be far more difficult. I want to commend the university for this initiative. I want to thank you for inviting me. I literally rushed from Malawi to make sure I could be here, driving 6 hours to Durban after jumping off a plane, but it is well worth it. This is not academic or abstract. This is our reality, and I thank you.
Wow. Let's give Dr. Francis another round of applause, please. Dr. Francis, thank you. Thank you so much for reminding us about the importance of connecting, of partnering, and just allowing us to walk with you through the journey of experiencing COVID in your own space. My colleagues who are located there have a methodology called self-reflexive methodology, which is centered on telling stories as part of sort of narrative creation and retelling stories for change. And I think that the way that you told your story today was extremely powerful, and it resonated so much with what we have experienced here. And I think that we live richer as individuals. And just to echo the sentiments around climate change, which we here in Durban have experienced very recently, you know. Yeah. So I think your message cannot be any clearer, colleagues, and I think it is about our own collective efforts of coming together and actually taking agency in moving forward. I know that we've gone. No, you were perfect. It's because we started late. And I think maybe as a best way forward, I'm going to maybe request that if you've got a question for Dr. Francis, that maybe you keep it and then we engage at tea, if you don't mind, Dr. Francis, over tea, because my concern is that the next panel was supposed to be up 30 minutes ago. So if I may thank Dr. Francis, and I'm going to request that if you have a question and if you'd like to engage with Dr. Francis on this keynote, if you can, please, during tea time and lunchtime. I think Dr. Francis will be with us throughout.